Hello everyone, I'm Stephen Carleton. I'm the Director of the Centre for Critical and Creative Writing here at the University. I am going to be your host for this evening for this June UQ Book Club with the illustrious Tony Birch and his much celebrated novel, The White Girl. But before we do that, I would like to commence by acknowledging the Jagera and the Turrbal as the traditional custodians of the beautiful grounds on which the University of Queensland is situated. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to all of you who've joined us in such robust numbers again this evening. Really terrific turnout, which is great, Tony, for book sales as well, right? We're supporting you there. Before I introduce Tony to you all, a little bit of housekeeping, just for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. We'll kick things off with me asking Tony questions about his writing process and the background to his approach, I guess, to writing this book and some of the issues it touches upon. And then we will hear a little excerpt from the book that Tony will read to us, and then I'll start leading the conversation into the content of the book and then open things up to you at home. So it'll kind of be about half us talking and half you asking questions. So please type your questions into the Q&A tab, that function at the bottom of your screen, not into the chat function. The chat is turned off and it won't work. So those will be filtered by Emily and Mary, our behind-the-scenes experts, and come through to us. And then we'll end the evening with a vote for next month's book. And we're going to do things slightly differently to the way that we did that this week, but more of those details soon. But Tony Birch. Tony is the author of 3 novels. This one, the best-selling The White Girl, and Ghost River, which won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous Writing, and Blood, which was also shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. He's also the author of 3 short story collections. In 2017, he was awarded the Patrick White Literary Award. He's a frequent contributor to ABC local and national radio, a regular guest at writers' festivals, and a climate justice campaigner. He lives in Melbourne. Tony, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So great to have you here. And congratulations on The White Girl winning the 2020 New South Wales Premier's Prize for Indigenous Writing, and also being shortlisted for this year's Miles Franklin. That's an incredible achievement.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I just wanted to begin by picking up on a statement that you made in your author's note, if I may be so bold as to read that out. You said, I would not presume to tell the story of any child removed from family and community, or that of the people left behind to deal with loss and the resultant trauma. What I do hope for this novel is that the love and bravery conveyed by Odette and Sissy provide some understanding of the tenacity and love within the hearts of those who suffered the theft of their blood. And you dedicate that book to them. Understanding, tenacity, love, those are the descriptors that you're using to describe your motivations for writing the story. It sounds to me like you had a really clear idea from the outset what sort of a story it was going to be, and also what sort of a story you didn't feel you were positioned to tell. Can you just elaborate a little bit for us around those ethical parameters, I suppose, and the motivators for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is you're right that I did have a clear idea of what the story would be, or not the detailed story, but certainly the overarching idea was that I wanted to write a novel which really privileged the tenacity and courage of Aboriginal people, particularly Aboriginal women who had struggled for decades, most of the 20th century in particular, to save children from child theft. And when children, of course, were taken from family and community to fight, usually for the rest of their lives, often successfully, sometimes not successfully, to have those children returned. And I had done a lot of work as a historian looking at Aboriginal women's writing from reserves and missions, particularly in Victoria. And I knew those stories very well. Of course, I knew the stories from people in family who had lost children to institutions and to the state. And I actually don't know an Aboriginal family who has not lost a child to the state. I don't know of any family who haven't gone through that terrible history. So that it was a story to put courage and love and tenderness at the heart of the novel. The comment that you allude to, though, is just to be sure that there is a real ethical issue here, and that is that Aboriginal people have been denied the right to tell our stories for most of white Australian history, and therefore it's absolutely vital that each story or each community story is owned by those individuals or communities, and therefore that while I would hope, and I think it's been successful, that my book has reflected the emotion, the feeling, the history, the circumstances of removals, it's certainly not representative of any individual's experience. So that I've been really fortunate since the book has been released in the conversations I've had with Aboriginal people, just things to hear from old Aboriginal women say, oh, it's a true story. And what they mean by that, it's not that it's not fiction, that they believe it's a good heart story and they feel that I did a good job. So I feel satisfied in that. And I feel satisfied that particularly Odette Brown and her granddaughter Sissy, the two fictional characters, that I hope that I reflected the objectives of what I wanted to do as they're represented through the courage of a woman and her granddaughter.
That's a terrific response, and it's anticipated a couple of questions I want to ask you as well, and it helps me understand that rich kind of a background and knowledge that you bring, that you're able to furnish all of the beautiful domestic details. But I'll come to that a little bit later. Just about so you've got all of that research, you've got that cultural knowledge, you've got that family knowledge to draw upon. It feels like it's very much a novel that it's kind of been burning inside you to tell. I read in an interview with you in The Guardian where you claim that the first draft came out in 8 weeks. I mean, it's kind of incredibly quick writing time. Is that true?
Yeah, look, unfortunately, you never give a journalist a good byline. There's half a sentence there, Stephen. I'll give you the full sentence, and the full sentence runs something like this. It took me about 8 weeks to get the first draft down and a year to finish the second draft. And what I mean by, I had a really strong sense of the framework of the story. So what I decided to do was to build that straight away. And part of that is the pragmatism of I've always worked full time when I've written. So I have my academic work to do. And I just had a window where I could have 2 months to do that. And basically that I would understand, of course, that would be sort of a fairly rough job. But I knew that when I finished that I had the overall narrative structure, I had the sense of what was going to happen. And then, of course, I was going back and working in much more detail with the book. So it's not a way that I usually work, although I think my publisher, Aviva Tuffield, will probably tell you I work pretty quickly. And I tend to work in what I suppose we would call creative bursts. So it's the case that I've got a new book of stories coming out next year, and about half of those stories have been written since the COVID lockdown. And I do get I suppose a creative rush, and I've got that sort of sense for, when it's working and you're in the sort of writing zone, you just keep going. And then what I find is that I'm like a racing car that runs out of petrol. You're going really fast, and then you don't gradually slow down. You just stop and you go, okay, that's it, I'm done. And then, of course, you go back and do the really hard work of rewriting and editing. And I actually enjoy that. And I really enjoy working with editors, because one of the things I love about editors is when they give you advice to improve the work. I really love that, that really generous challenge from an editor to go back to the work and improve it. So I find that stage really enjoyable. But I suppose for me is that it's about having really trustful relationships with your publisher. So I've done a lot of books now of UQP, and I sent a story recently to Aviva Tuffield at UQP, and the character changed names a couple of times in the story, because now if I was a first-time writer, she'd probably say, I think this writer's got problems. They can't even remember character's name, but Aviva just thinks, oh, that's a Tony sort of tick. We'll get over that, and so
We'll clean that up in the third
we've got a
draft.
very good relationship with Aviva in particular.
Yeah, that's great. Does that mean then that you, when you're writing in those intense short bursts, does that mean that you're a writer who maps out the story chapter by chapter beforehand?
No.
Or do you just dive in and see where the process of
It's interesting.
discovery?
It's probably, sorry, it's probably something in between that. I'm not a writer, and people may know I taught creative writing at Melbourne Uni for about 12 years. And, students used to say, I sat at the computer screen looking at it and nothing happened. And I say, well, walk away from the screen. Or they would say, I just started to write and see where I'd end up. And they ended up in a dead end. And I'd say, well, stop doing that as well. So no, I certainly don't just open up the computer or a page and start writing and see what's going to happen. I have a notebook, and what I tend to do is, rather than a chapter by chapter structure, I tend to, in my mind or in my observational work, I do a lot of work watching people and going to places, is that I'll write what are fragments of scenes, what are moments, and they tend to fill pages of a notebook. And then as I'm going through the story, I'll reflect on those. So that one of the ones that would be apparent to people who've read The White Girl, I had an image of a younger Aboriginal woman and an older Aboriginal woman hugging, and that became a vital paragraph in this book when Wanda, the young Aboriginal woman from the hotel, asks Odette, can she hug her? And you have this incredible tenderness between the two women. That scenes like that was written before the novel. It was, where would it be? Where would it be? And to find the moment where it mattered, because I wanted to convey how much physicality and physical touch and love means to people who've been separated. And it was a case of wanting to convey to readers that sort of emotion conveyed through touch. So that would have been in the notebook along with many others. With my short fiction, it's a little different. I actually can carry a short story structure in my head. So I can write a short story without writing any notes. But I couldn't do it with a novel. My head's, I've got an inflated view of myself apparently, but my head is not that big. Yeah.
That's reassuring to hear. Well, let's pick up that. That seems like a nice segue then. That the mention of the touch and the importance of touch, and that hug to here. You read from a section of the book.
Yeah, sure.
Going to read us the section with Odette.
Yeah. So, look, I do tend to read the same short piece all the time, but because it is so pivotal. And one of the things that I would say in reading this short piece is that it conveys so much of the motivation of the novel, and that was that it would be a novel about love, even though we're dealing with the prospect of terrible violence occurring, and the fact that Aboriginal people we know on the periphery of the novel have historically experienced real horrific violence. I felt that the Aboriginal people in the novel, in real time in the novel, I would focus on tenderness, touch, beauty, and love, rather than on the sort of violence being done to bodies. And this little scene is indicative of how the physical bodies of a grandmother and granddaughter have so much meaning in the way that they interact with each other. So it's very self-explanatory. Odette found Sissy busy arranging wood in the fire pit beside the cast iron bath. She knocked on the window to get her granddaughter's attention. Sissy looked up and smiled. When she was satisfied the fire was ready to be lit, she washed her hands under the backyard tap and walked into the kitchen. Good morning, Nana. She hugged her grandmother. Morning to you too. Have you had your breakfast? Odette asked. Yes, Sissy said. I had some bread and jam after I got out of bed, but I'm hungry again. What about you? Odette brushed Sissy's fringe away from her eyes and tucked it behind an ear. I'm not surprised you're hungry. You've been out there working hard. Take your jumper off and I'll make you a sandwich. You walked all the way from the graveyard and back, Nana. That's harder work than I've been doing. Odette felt the pain in her side and grimaced. What's wrong? Sissy asked. Odette dismissed Sissy's question. There's nothing wrong with me, young miss. She picked up a box of matches and went into the backyard. Sissy had prepared a good fire. Odette lit the match, stood back, and watched as the flames quickly took to the timber. She went back into the kitchen and made lunch. After they'd eaten, Sissy got up from the table and looked out of the window at the bath. "I reckon it's ready, Nan. It's my turn to spread the coals and to heat the water." "That's hard work," Odette said, "but if you want to do it, I won't stop you." "You can have first bath today, Nan." Odette wouldn't hear of it. "No, I won't be. You always go first, and that's the way we'll leave it." Odette was in the laundry struggling to saw through a rock-hard block of velvet soap when Sissy called out to her, "I'm ready, Nan." Until the previous summer, Odette had always helped wash and dry Sissy at bath time. But now that her granddaughter was developing, Odette left the girl to enjoy privacy until it was time to wash her hair. She came out of the laundry carrying a tin pail, a hairbrush, and a bottle of castor oil. She moved a wooden chair alongside the tub, sat down and dipped the pail into the water. "Pass me the soap, sis, and put your head back." Sissy closed her eyes and rested her neck against the edge of the bath. Odette gently poured the warm water over Sissy's head, her hair darkening as the water ran onto her shoulders. Odette massaged Sissy's scalp, working the soap into a rich lather. She then rinsed Sissy's hair with several pails of water, poured a few drops of castor oil into one hand, and raked the oil through Sissy's hair with her fingers. Sissy sighed with pleasure. "I love this, Nana. It's the best part of the week." "I'm happy you do," Odette smiled, "because I love it too."
It's beautiful. Thank you, Tony. I actually had that scene marked out when I was listing the questions I wanted to ask you, and I'm sure when it comes to engaging with our audience at home as well, they'll want to be talking about some of their favourite moments. You've already touched on this, but I love the beautifully observed domestic detail in that scene. You talked about the physicality, but just the velvet soap, the castor oil, the way that the hot water system works or doesn't work. That and some of the broader details too. The crushed glass used to bait foxes and dogs. How does a boy who grew up in Fitzroy paint those pictures so vividly?
Well, I mean, we had velvet soap as well, and we had dogs that were being baited. I think that it's interesting. I think that the kitchen scenes, so the scenes around the house in Dean, those scenes would not be any different than the way I grew up. So I grew up next door to my grandmother in inner city Fitzroy. We would have had a similar experience of sharing beds with our parents and grandparents, having that sort of half of the kitchen, the wood stove to keep you warm. And I've written in a lot of my fiction, Stephen, the kitchen table was the most pivotal place in the house and in the story. So, all of our gathering as a family was around the kitchen table and still is. So I think it was easy to convey that. So there's nothing, I think, around the domestic nature of the book that was foreign to me. And in fact, there's that when they talk about eating fried bread, and it's almost like a host that melts in your mouth. For anyone who's been to communion, you'll understand that. And we used to, sort of having fried bread and dripping is sort of seen as a miserable dinner for poorer people, but we loved it when we had fried bread in a pan on a Sunday night. It was a delicacy, or we thought it was at the time. So it is deliberately nostalgic in that sense. There's a lot of love around food in the book. The issue for me that is really about having to be more inventive and to create a scene or a place I don't know is the way that in this book, the sort of regional country dilapidated town. I've never lived outside the inner city. As people know, I rarely cross Bell Street, which is about 6 kilometres up the road from here. And I've literally, I think in a lot of my books, I have conjured this sort of town that I use in a lot of my fiction. And what I did for this, Stephen, which I think would maybe for some of you would be writers, is that while I could invent a country town in my head, and as a writer, there's a lot you can do with inventiveness and creativity. The two things that I did for this is that I had been to a very small country town in Victoria, which struck me as the sort of town I wanted to create. and there were a lot of things around that town about social division that would have worked for me. But I actually drew a map. So before I wrote a line, I had a detailed map of the town that I'd created with streets and stuff, so that when I was writing, I actually had the map to one side of me on my desk, and I would look at the map and imagine where Odette would be, where she might be walking. So that mattered to me. So it wasn't just something conjured in creativity. The town that I did visit, I took a lot of photographs, I took a lot of notes, and then I created the map. I think the map was actually probably pivotal to me feeling that the experience of the town was authentic and rang true. The other one, though, that you allude to is the issue around the baiting of dogs and the people responsible for that, the Kane family. There is two houses in this that are visited. One is the empty house that Sissy visits, and the other is the house of the Canes, which is in complete ruin, this sort of colonial ruin. When I was a historian, I did a lot of work on colonial ruins in Western Victoria. So I've actually been into houses like that, houses that were simply abandoned decades ago and left. And I've been into houses where people left everything in the house and just walked off. So I was able to draw on experience for that also.
Yeah, that's fascinating actually. On the mapping, that's really interesting to me as well, because one of the things I noted is that the book very carefully marks or observes the way that the Australian legal system and various levels of government map things. You know, they mark and they marshal borders and boundaries in this book. You've got Dean's Line and the boundary between Dean and Quarry Town. This is a form, it strikes me, it's a form of segregation that we've never really had an open conversation about in Australia, or named as apartheid, you know, in this country. How are you wanting to examine those boundaries that you've just kind of alluded to as not just physical ones, but as psychological boundaries and emotional ones in the book as well?
Yeah, look, I think the psychological boundaries are the most important, because by the time the novel opens, the town is in pretty much a dying town anyway, and the policing of Dean's Line is really non-existent. I mean, no one stops Odette, Millie, Khan, Sissy going into town anymore. I do allude to the fact that when Odette goes to the police station, remembering how all the Aboriginal people who'd played up would be in the cells out the back. So it is a town where that line would have been policed very strongly. It's not police, but the impact of that real history, the legislative history, is what it does to people psychologically, where they feel safe, where they feel they can be, and where they can't be. And it's quite interesting, so that when Sissy finds herself in danger from Aaron Kane when she rides up on her bike, Sissy is in fact interesting, because she even though she's an Aboriginal girl who understands in a sense what is unjust in the town, she's also very naive, because her grandmother has been very protective of her. So when she goes off on her bike, she doesn't sense any danger, but of course she's in danger because of that lack of safety once she gets outside the town boundary. The other one I think, though, is that's key to this, Stephen, is the way that so-called caste legislation and exemption acts are policed. So that in regard to the Exemption Act, we have a wonderful Aboriginal man, Jack Haynes, who proudly boasts at one point that he's been exempted from the Aborigines Act, which is a piece of legislation that dominated Aboriginal legislation in New South Wales and Queensland. And yet there's an acute sense of shame with that. And he is really put in his place by that policeman who treats him, really in a really condescending way. And the issue around there is that the legislation works not so much to exempt someone from the Aborigines Acts, but to control them psychologically. So we know that an Aboriginal person who's been exempted, not only are they separated from their family and separated from their culture, if they transgress, or if they might become politically active or speak up, they can lose that exemption certificate very quickly. So it has enormous levels of control over people's behaviour and makeup. Now, I think the two female characters that are interesting for me here are Odette understands that. So Odette understands how to perform deference even if she doesn't actually believe in it. So she understands she's got to negotiate with the police and other people in a very particular way. Whereas Millie Khan, who has some protection because she married into a Afghan family, which gives her some exemption in another way, she's right up in that policeman's face. And I wanted to show a very feisty Aboriginal woman who really wouldn't take a backward step. I mean, neither does Odette, but Odette negotiates, whereas Millie just gives O'Shea a really hard time. So it's about Aboriginal people having to, for our whole lives, having to, I often say this, an Aboriginal person, your whole life is a compromise. Every day is a compromise. You've got to negotiate every day, your life. And in the period that I'm writing about, people had to negotiate in very acute and profoundly emotional and unsettling ways that really tested their own humanity and, of course, devalued their humanity in the face of white Australia.
That's beautifully expressed, Tony. Thank you. And that resilience and humanity and compassion comes through in spades in the novel. I want to pick up on a question there, but just to let the people at home, and we've had more people join us as well. It's great. We've got really, really robust numbers, which is good. So hopefully lots of questions from home as well. Feel free to start now entering your questions into the Q&A section, and they'll be filtered through to me to ask Tony as well by Emily and Mary. And they will come through shortly. So feel free to start getting those down, and I'll just ask another couple of questions in the interim to segue into your conversation with Tony. It was that point that you just made there too. And one of the things I love about the novel, Tony, is that its examination of race relations. Well, it's overwhelmingly, you know, it's got that kind of passionate and political focus on Aboriginal people and working within this kind of white system of surveillance. But the book also does this lovely job of reminding us that regional Australia is not just black and white. There's a rich commingling of cultures right from the beginning of kind of settlement / invasion. We've got Jewish Dr. Singh, we've got the Polish immigrant in the train station kind of running away from authorities there. You know, lots of people kind of being policed as well. And of course, Millie Khan, who you've just mentioned, and her Afghani Muslim husband. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your connection to that particular history? You've got an Afghani heritage as well.
It's quite interesting because I've been working on a poetry collection where one of the people who know my poetry work, I've produced a lot of poems which were called Archive Box, which I started to write many years ago and published several of those. I've been working on a long poem on Butta Khan, a man who my great-grandmother married. Butta Khan came to the colony of Victoria in the 1890s, so before there was no Australia as a nation when he came here. And then Butta Khan was subject to the infamous dictation test in the White Australia policy when he wanted to take my great-grandmother back to India for a family visit. So they had young kids at the time. And people may know that if you came back into Australia or you wanted to migrate to Australia, you could be given that dictation test in any language, including Mandarin. And yeah, Butta was a very intelligent man, but his Mandarin wasn't that great. And he had to apply for a form of exemption certificate, which was to allow him to take my great-grandmother back home to India and then come back without having to face that that dictation test and probably not being allowed back into Australia. So that one of the issues there is a really strong relationship between Afghani or Punjabi men often. So the definition of where they're from and their own identity is, yeah, we're using a modern language. He would have lived somewhere in the Punjab, but when he was living there, he could have been in Afghanistan or India. This is before partition, so a lot of that is sort of a bit fluid. But the really important point is that the issue, and even though Yusuf Khan doesn't play a big role in the book, the thing that struck me about introducing Millie was to say that, yeah, these people really mattered. Butta Khan was a really dignified man who was Muslim, was very devout, very well liked, never got in any trouble with the police. So we know this through all the testimonials that were presented to support his exemption. And yet again, a bit like Jack Haynes, he was treated in a very humiliating manner repeatedly by the Australian government to have to go through this process of deference. And I find it shameful to think that a man would have to do that. I mean, a very dignified man. So it was a personal sort of nod to him, to respect him. But of course, you know, some of your the audience will know, this is also part of a remarkable history across Australia, where families came from Afghanistan, from the Punjab, and some people call them the Cameleers, etc. But it's a bit, it's quite narrow to think of the Maori in that way, because you're talking about a migrant community who had impact in Australia in a remarkable array of industries. So he worked in, he was a so-called hawker, so he worked in cloth and haberdashery and stuff like that. The important thing for me about You Ask the Connection is that this is not just one man. I grew up in Fitzroy when there were about 3 or 4 households of the extended family who were all Muslim. They had their own mosque in the back of a terrace house in Fitzroy. They visited that mosque regularly, and they were integral through the community. And I think for me, it's important to note that, because the discrimination that Muslim people face in Australia now because of sort of populist racism, it's as if these people, have landed on our doorstep yesterday. And we know that, these communities have been part of Australia since the first fleet. Yeah. And the Khan family in Fitzroy remembered as a really vital part of that community. And I still have relatives who live in Fitzroy who are a relative. So I have a lot of cousins from that line of the family who still live in Fitzroy.
On identity then, we've got a question from Fiona. She says, I'm really interested in the different approaches to identity that you raise in the book. The very superficial definition imposed by the white culture, and then the more nuanced approach of characters such as Jim, who is able to see someone's heart, their values, their stories. She says, can you expand a little on your conceptualization of identity?
Yeah, I can. And I mean, I did another event last night, and people were, one of the things that we know, and again, in sort of populist versions of identity in Australia, is that, we will hear people say that, oh, look, what we need in Australia is a much more strict definition of Aboriginality, so we know who and who isn't an Aboriginal person. Like, white Australia has always feared not being able to control Aboriginal identity. So one of the cornerstones of invasion and dispossession is the control of Aboriginal identity through legislation. Mm-hmm. And when I was working as a historian at Melbourne University, I'd read a great PhD by a guy called John McCorkudale. And in that, he had done really diligent work. And at that time, and this is going back 2 decades, Stephen, the number of quite distinct legislative forms of Aboriginal identity at the time, so it's about the year 2000, there were 60 different definitions of Aboriginality that had been enacted from Federation onwards, either at the state or federal level. So that's 60 different ways you can or can't be a blackfella. And so I'd say that's pretty inconsistent and hypocritical and uncertain. And you can look at why those legislative frameworks were adopted, and they're either to control Aboriginal people, to economically disadvantage Aboriginal people, or to remove Aboriginal people from country. And so there's the uncertainty around Aboriginal identity is not something that's come out of the Aboriginal community, it's come out of the white community, and certainly legislative community. Having said that, I think that for me, the real issue around Aboriginal identity is to understand that the histories of different nations in Australia is really important to understand. So you're talking, in the case of people living around Sydney or Melbourne, you're now talking about people who have faced invasion and enormous numbers of white people for over 200 years. Whereas if you were to go into the Northern Territory before the Second World War, the number of non-Aboriginal people in the whole Northern Territory before the Second World War was about 500 people. So you're talking about a very small number of people having very limited or no impact on Aboriginal people at all. That picks up, of course, after the post-war era. So the first thing we've got to recognise is that you're dealing with really distinct cultural histories. So that Victorian Aboriginal society is based on culture and kinship, not on colour or biology or biological definition. So the 1886 so-called Half-Caste Act, the infamous first legislation to quantify people as blood quantum and caste of full blood, half caste, quarter caste, octoroon was instigated in the colony of Victoria, and it was the first attempt and one of the first global attempts in the Western world to divide people according to blood quantum. And what has happened, of course, is that Aboriginal people have defied that and refused that ever since. So my good friend, Gary Foley, always says that culture trumps DNA any time, so that you learn who you are mostly through your cultural connections. And that, I think, is important in regard to Sissy, or the story of Sissy. And I don't want to be disrespectful to anyone, but why not? One of the things that I know, and it's a terrible thing that we still have to face, is that for a lot of non-Aboriginal people, even those who want to meet an Aboriginal person or to work with an Aboriginal person, many of us are just not dark enough, to be quite honest. So I've been, when I was a student at Melbourne University, and the university wanted to do great photo opportunities with Aboriginal students, and you'd be asked to go, and then you turn up, they literally looking at you, they're thinking, can we get a darker one, someone who look better on the poster. And that can become divisive amongst Aboriginal people, so we've got to avoid that. But we're a very strong community in Victoria, and by and large, those sort of processes of racism, we won't let split us as a community. And I'm an old man for an Aboriginal man. I'm 63, so I'm over the hill. I actually don't have any of those sort of doubts or anxieties about who I am, or that when people ask racist questions or ask for explanations about your identity, they don't penetrate me in a way that creates anxiety in me at all. I mean, I can't even be bothered telling people to fuck off, it doesn't affect me. But for a couple of my kids, I know they can be very anxious around that, and they feel like they're under the spotlight. They feel like people are demanding something of them. So to just sum up the question is that, for me, I think that the word that the questioner used was nuanced. I think it's a very nuanced and complicated issue around identity. And I think the best that non-Aboriginal people can do is to allow us to decide who we are and how we are, and accept that genuine example of self-determination.
Thank you. That's a really, really fulsome answer. Luani asks, I'm really interested in how Tony identified himself earlier in the conversation as not a writer. And I heard you say that too. And I went, did I hear that correctly? She says, I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about how you define yourself as a writer, as opposed to a person who has written 3 books.
Well, I suppose I think I'm my stepfather, who is a genuine labourer all his life. I see myself as a worker. So I always see the writing as work, and that I don't see it. I don't regard it as art, and that's not a put down. I think that what I'm doing is creating work around important stories, and older Aboriginal women. A wonderful woman who was a real mentor for me, Auntie Eleanor Harding, who spent a lot of time in Melbourne, but actually came from Darnley Island. She's a Torres Strait woman. Wonderful, wonderful woman. She said to me, and she knocked around Fitzroy, where I grew up, so it's a very tough area. And she said, this writing, you do it really well. That's your job. I want you got to tell our story. So, when Aboriginal people go to university, they say, you've got to be a lawyer or a doctor, and we need lawyers and doctors. But she said, my work was storytelling. So I do see it as work, and I do see it as trying to sort of produce work that tells a story about social justice, a story about value in people. I think that if I start to think of myself too much as a writer, I suppose like anyone else, I could get too egotistical or up myself a little bit. So, and I'm not putting that down. A lot of people call themselves writer, and of course I'm a writer, but I don't look in the mirror when I get up in the morning and say, oh, there's Tony Birch, the writer. I really don't. I just think, that my storytelling is a role to play for my community and to represent people. And I suppose the other thing that's relative there is that because I don't see myself as a writer as lifestyle, but maybe by trade, so I think there is a difference. What I think essentially I do, so that I write fiction, both long form and short form. I write poetry, so I've got a second poetry book, I think, about to be picked up, hopefully by UQP. and of course I write essays and commentary, is that what I see that I have done in the last 2 decades is that I see an issue, or I hear a story, or I see something in the street, and writing becomes a way of communicating my response to that. So if someone said, well, what are you? I suppose I'd say, if I'm anything, I would, imagine saying on your job, I'm a communicator. Well, that's what I do. I communicate through words the way I see the world. And if I didn't think that there was value in people reading those words, of course I wouldn't do it. So I like the fact that I'm very, very tied to the idea of a relationship with reading. I see the writer and reader in a contract with each other, and it's a contract that requires generosity. So I think I'm a generous reader, and I think as a writer, I write in a generous way because I want readers to enjoy the work, and I want readers to get value out of my work. It's really important to me.
We're getting signs of that value being expressed here, Tony. Herlinda has got a comment rather than a question. She writes, I really enjoyed reading your book, Tony. Thank you. Even though the themes deal with the shameful history about the treatment of Aboriginal people, I'm left with a feeling of hope for fairness and ultimately optimism. I adored the character of Odette. What a beautiful woman. Julianne asks, the question, she says, the novel will provide essential information in high schools on race laws in Australia. I agree with that too. How do you think teachers and students will treat the role of police in the book?
Yeah, I don't know. I hope they, I'm not sure, but it'll be worth saying, but the book is already being taught in schools. So I know that it's taught down here in Victoria, not at year 12 level. I don't know about other states, but to get a book taught at year 12, you've got to go through these committees that, like, I don't know, there's some Stalinist committee you've got to go to. And we had the shocking experience in Victoria 2 years ago where I think the 41 texts that could be taught in English, there was not one Aboriginal text of those 41 texts, not one. And a friend of mine who was on the selection committee, who resigned, I suppose, in disgust, he said he was shocked that people felt that the issues were a little sensitive. He said it seemed odd when they were teaching books on the Holocaust and the horrors of war that learning the history of stolen children in Australia was a bit too sensitive. I think that the book is being taught and really enjoyed. So I've already had responses from teachers. It's taught in Japan, where quite a bit of my work is taught. So it's already been taught. I was supposed to be there now, actually, in Japan, but of course the COVID stuff ended that. I think the way that the police, the way that I hope that the police would be seen is pretty simple. Bill Shea's a policeman who grew up in the town. He was a kid who played with Aboriginal kids before they went to school, and then change comes and he becomes a town policeman and stands by and sees children removed. And Odette, as we know, confronts him about that shame in his past. And the only way that Bill can deal with his shame is to drink. He's a drunk. And Bill represents to me the tragedy of racism on non-Aboriginal people, whether they be proactive in racist legislation or bystanders or just witnesses. I think racism has a negative effect on everyone. I mean, obviously it affects Aboriginal people in a much more particular and destructive way, but I think people who grow up learning to either hate or to devalue other people, it has a shocking effect on them as well. And some people ignore that. And I think someone like Bill, he's quite aware of that, and he's quite a tragic figure because of it. Sergeant Lowe is a different figure, and one of the word again used earlier about nuance. One of the ways we could think about Sergeant Lowe is I could have portrayed a more nuanced figure. Maybe someone who went home at night and did macrame, or hugged his kids and read them bedtime stories, which of course he could have done. But I do need to say this, and there was in a review, a good review of the book, but one of the criticism was that Lowe was just a bad man, and surely when we're writers, we've got to create more rounded characters. Well, we don't actually. Some people can be just bad characters, and there's a real truth, a shocking truth in this character. Because I did a lot of research by looking at letters, I could tell your audience that I read the letters of two Aboriginal women who wrote for 2 decades to have a child return from when she was a young girl to an adult, the pleadings and writing about their love, writing about the brothers and sisters of that child just being distraught because their sister wasn't coming home, and writing to politicians and police. And the police who clearly, by reading those words, it was evidenced of how much suffering those women went through for their life. And I think really one of them died of a broken heart because of never seeing her daughter again. Those policemen being able to write back with the most chilling responses, devoid of any emotion, although they understood. And they would say, we understand the distress you are facing, but what you need to understand, we're doing this for the benefit of your daughter. So these figures, these bureaucrats who allowed this to happen, they're very frightening figures, not because they're physically violent or that they erupt. It's because they deal with the pain and suffering of people with literally no emotion, and that's quite chilling. And in this way, this policeman represents that really chilling response to people suffering.
Mm. Our participants have read the book, so we can give away spoilers. I was just thinking that Lowe, he disappears right at the end of the novel there, doesn't he? Like he just never turns to am I right to kind of suspect maybe Jack kind of got to him privately, or?
Well, you can hope as much as you like, Steve. You've just alluded to, we can share a secret with your audience, and they don't have to tell anyone else. So you're really onto something, because when I wrote the first or second draft, I'd built up such a hatred of Lowe that I wanted Jack to kill him. So in the first draft, there's that lovely scene when Jack walks out. Well, it's not a lovely scene. The scene when he walks out onto the veranda and he picks up the wood axe.
Yeah.
And then Alma comes out and puts her hand on Jack's shoulder and says, "Don't do this." And that's a very sensible response, because in the early 1960s, when we know capital punishment is still in place in places like Victorian, New South Wales and Queensland, had Jack stepped off that veranda and hit the policeman over the head and killed him and been caught for that, which he likely would, he would not only go to prison, he would face a death sentence.
Yeah.
And he's an Aboriginal man who would be lost to his family. But in the first draft, Jack does follow him down the street and he hits him over the head and kills him, like with the axe. And then I just thought, no, that's what I want Jack to do. Alma doesn't want Jack to do that, and I don't think it's good for Jack that I get him to kill. Yeah. Now, so I stopped that. But there's something else that's really important here, that not only about Alma's common sense. When Sissy goes back to Dean as a young woman and Millie Khan says he's out there, that's in fact, now you may wish that Jack got to him, Stephen, but I think Millie's comment, he's still out there, is that what I wanted to convey there is that not so much Lowe as an individual, but as a sort of symbol of racism and a symbol of malevolence. Yeah. That, he's still out, and he is still out there now. Yeah. So in other words, that we know that the shocking figures and statistics of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth in institutions and in prison.
Playing out now, isn't it? Deaths in custody is the figures.
So we understand that violence is still with us. So to me, Sergeant Lowe is represented in those authorities, whether they be police, prison guards, legislators, who still want to see the destruction of Aboriginal people. So he will always be out there, and it's up to us, Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people of good character and people of ethics and values to confront that. I mean, it's why it's not surprising that the Australian manifestation of Black Lives Matter in regard to deaths in custody, we know why this is so important now, that, an Aboriginal woman in Victoria can die in a prison cell because she fell asleep on a train, It's very dangerous for Aboriginal people to be in the public arena in ways that are not described as being different. So I did a lot of work on the outcome of the original deaths in custody hearings, and one of the shocking outcomes was that there were Aboriginal men and women who presented to hospital with respiratory problems, heart problems, asthma, mild strokes, people who had not partaken in any alcohol at all, who were literally sent by the hospital casualty staff to the jail because they said, I've got a drunken Aboriginal person here, just because of them swaying or not, you know, their slurred speech or whatever, and they're actually suffering a stroke or they're suffering a heart attack. So those sort of people are represented in Sergeant Low, and they will always be there, and we need to be really diligent in confronting them.
Just a couple more comments coming through. Tony Fiona says she found Low a sadly very believable character. Cassandra says, I just wanted to say a huge thank you. Such a beautiful, authentic voice and a wonderful novel. So we've probably got time for those of you from home. There's time for maybe one more question from you if you want to, but I've got another one for you in the meantime, Tony. Maybe just tapping into the piece's political context. It's written very much in the lead up to the '67 referendum, and I found, I'm a person who thinks that he knows a reasonable amount about Australian history, including, that recent Indigenous history, and yet the detail about the exemption certificates and the degree of marshalling around that was an eye-opener for me, to be really honest. In all the ways that you've talked about, you've done such a beautiful job, I think, of humanising these stories. And it kind of, reading about that, it kind of, it felt like the '67 referendum was decades away, and yet it was only a short time away in the timing of the novel, wasn't it? And it was so overwhelmingly embraced by the Australian public and passed. Why do you think that movement had bipartisan political support, overwhelming public support, in the high 90s, while the Uluru Statement and a contemporary vote to enshrine Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, contemporary Indigenous issues seem such a long way off ever being realised? Do you think hearts have hardened between now and then? What's happened?
I don't actually. I think they've probably always been hard. Though I think that there's a really important issue here, and I don't want to bore people as a historian. Most people don't really understand the complexities of the '67 referendum. The first thing we need to understand, it wasn't a referendum to give Aboriginal people the vote. And I know that people who know the history a little bit will know that's not true, but the popularised history is that it gave Aboriginal people the vote. Now, it may have introduced the vote to some Aboriginal people, but people may be shocked that there are Aboriginal people voting in Victoria from the turn of the 20th century, depending, of course, again, on your legal status. So, if you were cast out as non-Aboriginal, if you were cast to being a non-Aboriginal person, having previously been legislated as an Aboriginal person, you could vote. So it's a very complex, hypocritical, and you can't make a definitive statement about it. So it's not about the vote. The referendum, this is the important point, was to give the Commonwealth the powers to enact legislation for the so-called benefit of Aboriginal people. So it was shifting the responsibility in a legislative sense away from the states to the Commonwealth. Now, there are all sorts of positive knock-on effects of that. But what people don't understand is that some people voted yes because, yes, they felt that Aboriginal people had been treated as non-citizens or second-class citizens and been counted in the census of having a numerical number that could be then linked to particular economic policies, etc., would make policy sense. But there were people who said, yes, it's important that the Commonwealth take responsibility for these people because we don't want to anymore. We're sick of taking responsibility for these people. We're sick of state governments having to pay the way of these people. So let the Commonwealth take responsibility. So in other words, although some people voted yes, they were voting yes to get rid of their Aboriginal problem and hand it over to the Commonwealth. So then you need to understand, well, within that cohort, there's a group of people who don't have who don't value Aboriginal people. So I think that it's a very complex history that can't be answered in a sort of definitive way. The other thing which is quite interesting, which very few people know about, is that the closer a voting booth was to an Aboriginal reserve, the stronger the no vote was. So in other words, people who lived near Aboriginal reserves didn't want Aboriginal people let out of those reserves once the state gave up their control. They wanted those people contained rather than be free. So again, their response was based on racism. Having said that, it is true that there were some really strong alliances between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in a positive way to get a positive outcome. So there was remarkable campaigners in the Aboriginal communities for the referendum, and some of the alliances they had were great. I think the difference between this and the Uluru Statement, and that again is a much more complex statement. Sorry, it's a much more complex issue than a set of poetic words. It's a very poetic statement, but I think it's problematic. But one of the issues that we've got to consider now is that I think there are people, particularly in Parliament, and I think Kerry O'Brien, the ex-ABC journalist who's retired, I did a session with Kerry O'Brien at the Brisbane Writers' Festival last year, and he made the view that he thinks that the government is behind opinion. In other words, and I think he's probably right, is that I think what people fear is that when you start to talk about constitutional reform and constitutional recognition, there are a lot of politicians who see that as having real legislative traction that they fear. So while there's a lot of symbolism in support of Aboriginal rights at the Commonwealth level, so apologies, reconciliation, etc., all of those are symbolic gestures and on their own don't make substantial changes. If you had genuine legislative recognition and change in the Parliament and in the Constitution, I think I think a lot of politicians, particularly on the conservative side of politics, really can't countenance that. And I think that the whole thing of personally, I think the whole issue of trying to put this to a referendum was wrong. It just drags out and problematizes an issue and brings all the races to the fore. I think strong political leadership would allow this to happen with an act of Parliament, and it wouldn't require a referendum. So the referendum is a sort of a deferral of responsibility, I think. I mean, it's a bit like the crazy idea to have a vote on Brexit that Cameron thought he would win, and it blew up in his face because he didn't want to make it. He didn't want to be responsible. So Scott Morrison or whoever was the Prime Minister should have just said, "No, this is what we're going to do." And I think a good political leader would have made it happen. And we haven't had a Prime Minister with enough strength and courage to do what has to be done.
Thank you, Tony. We're going to have to leave it on that note. We've got another question that we just don't have time to get to. I'm so sorry. Another couple of thank yous, though, very much for telling these stories, especially telling them in ways that can be taken into schools for our future generations. So we just need to hang around, and we're going to take a vote on the next month's book. So that's about to come up, but I just wanted to thank you very much, Tony, for sharing this book with us and for making yourself so available and for giving us such penetrating insights to your process and into the heart and what's driving the ideas driving the book. Before we say goodbye to Tony and say goodbye and wave farewell, you're already voting. It's come up. So this week we'd like you to vote on a theme for July's book. So would you like to see a current top 10 bestseller and author like Tony himself? Would you like us to look at a landmark or vintage UQP press, a classic from the ages? Would you like a Queensland themed work? Or would you like to look at a short story collection? So we will give you, you're voting enthusiastically, and two things are neck and neck. We will give you another 30 seconds and then we'll tie that off. In the meantime, I just need to say thank you. Thank you to Tony, of course, but also behind the scenes, thank you to Emily Sievers, Mary Brown, Olivia Brown, Weston Bruner, Louise Corniget from UQP, and our Executive Dean, Heather Zwicker, very much for the support and getting the book club up. It's a privilege being able to speak to authors like Tony directly. I think it's one of the things that makes our book club different to others. It's just been superb having you here in person, Tony. Really, really fabulous. Thank you so much.
Can I say thank you also before we sign off? Sure. And I don't know why we weren't allowed to vote, so I'm a bit disappointed in that. I would have voted for one of my short story collections. I do want to say thank you for having me, and I think it is a great initiative by the university and by UQP. But more importantly, it is a bit of an odd thing because, you know, apparently there's a lot of people in the room and you can't see any of them. But I do want to thank people who have attended, and if we ever get back to seeing each other in person and I get up to Queensland for the festival, and if you were in this room tonight, please come and see me and let me know that we'd already met online, and I can thank you in person. So, and thank you very much, Stephen. It was lovely to talk to you.
My pleasure, Tony. Thank you very much. We're going to post a recording of tonight's event on the website for the Centre for Critical and Creative Writing. So Google that if you wanted to see it again, or you've got a friend who missed out. Thank you very much, Tony. Thanks, everyone. So for those of you at home, the current top 10 bestseller has just edged out the Queensland themed work. So we're going to look at one of UQP's top 10 books, which is great. There's some books that I'm really keen to read. So we will get back to you in the next few days. Thank you very much. Thank you for being so engaged and for all of your questions. And see you, July the 30th is the date for the next UQ Book Club, and we will be in touch with details really soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great winter.